Karoline sat in her favorite spot at the Oak Room, a cozy restaurant she had been coming to for years. She loved this place. The waiters always greeted her with a smile, and the manager often stopped by to ask how she was doing. It wasn't just a restaurant to her, it was her special place, a little world of comfort where everything felt familiar. That day was just like any other. She had finished a long morning of meetings and came to relax. As soon as she stepped inside, she felt the warm, welcoming smell of fresh bread and roasted food. The sounds of clinking glasses, quiet chatter, and soft music made her feel at home. Karoline always sat by the big window. She liked watching the street outside. From there, she could see the small changes happening in the neighborhood. The new coffee shop across the road, the construction workers fixing a building, and sometimes even a parade marching down the street. It was a nice little tradition of hers, sitting there watching the world go by. She picked up the menu even though she already knew what she wanted. Her usual grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. It was her favorite meal and she looked forward to it every time she came here. As she glanced around, she noticed someone new among the staff. He was a tall man dressed in a sharp suit, with a serious look on his face. Karoline had never seen him before, but new workers came and went all the time. She didn't think too much of it. The waiter walked over, ready to take her order. Karoline smiled and asked for her usual. But before the waiter could leave, the man in the suit stepped up to her table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and firm. Karoline looked up, surprised. "Yes. I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the man said. Karoline frowned, confused. "What? You need to leave? Now," he repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but there was something about it that made Karoline feel uneasy. He was standing too close and his face was stiff, like he expected her to get upset. She looked around. The other customers had started to notice, sneaking glances at her. No one said anything, but she could feel their eyes on her. Her heart beat a little faster. This was strange. She had been coming here for years and nothing like this had ever happened before. "Can you tell me why?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. The man hesitated. He looked at her for a moment, then said, "I don't need to explain." Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly. That didn't make any sense. People couldn't just be told to leave a restaurant for no reason. She had seen people like this before, people who thought they could boss others around just because they felt like it. "Actually, I think you do," Karoline said, sitting up straighter. Her voice was still polite, but now there was a little bit of steel in it. "I've been coming here for years and I've never been treated like this. If I'm being asked to leave, I deserve to know why." The man pressed his lips together and glanced over his shoulder. Karoline followed his gaze and saw the manager standing near the kitchen. The manager wasn't saying anything. He was just watching. That was odd. The manager had always been friendly, checking in with customers, making sure they were happy. Why wasn't he stepping in now? Karoline felt something twist in her stomach. Something wasn't right. The man turned back to her. "You're disturbing the other customers," he said. Karoline raised an eyebrow. That was a weak excuse. She glanced around the restaurant. Everything was normal. People were eating, chatting, laughing quietly. No one seemed upset. "Disturbing?" she repeated. "I'm just sitting here ordering my lunch." The man didn't answer. He just stood there waiting for her to leave. Karoline took a deep breath. She wasn't the kind of person to cause trouble. But this wasn't fair. "I'll leave," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But only when you tell me why I have to." The manager still hadn't moved. His expression was unreadable, but Karoline could feel him watching her. Something was off. Someone had decided she needed to leave, but why? She looked at the man in the suit. "You still haven't told me the reason," she said again. The man's jaw clenched. He looked at the manager again as if asking for help. Finally, the manager sighed and walked over. He didn't look happy. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the manager said, his voice stiff and uncomfortable. "We've had a complaint about you." Karoline blinked. "A complaint? About me?" She frowned, trying to think. She had never caused trouble. She always greeted the staff, tipped well, and treated people with kindness. "What kind of complaint?" she asked. The manager hesitated. He looked at the man in the suit, then back at Karoline. "I can't say," he finally answered. Karoline stared at him. That made no sense. "Can't say?" she repeated. "You're asking me to leave, but you can't tell me why?" She could feel the tension in the air. The other customers were still watching, some pretending not to. The staff looked uneasy. The manager shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm going to have to ask you to go." Karoline's heart pounded, but she didn't move. "I've been a customer here for years," she said slowly. "And now, all of a sudden, I'm not welcome?" Without even an explanation? The manager didn't answer. The man in the suit crossed his arms. "We don't want any trouble," the man said. Karoline let out a small breath, steadying herself. "I don't either," she said. "But this isn't right." The silence stretched. She could feel it now, the quiet pressure in the room, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Would she get the explanation she deserved? Or was there something bigger going on here, something she hadn't seen coming? Karoline wasn't sure. But she knew one thing. She wasn't leaving without a fight. The manager hesitated for a moment. He looked uncomfortable, almost as if he didn't want to say what he was about to say. "I'm afraid I can't tell you that," he finally said, his voice stiff and formal. Karoline felt a surge of disbelief. "Wait a second," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Are you seriously telling me that I have to leave, but you won't even explain why?" The man standing next to her didn't say anything, but Karoline noticed his posture stiffen. He was uncomfortable too. It was obvious. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he just didn't want to be involved. Either way, Karoline didn't care about making him uncomfortable. She cared about the truth. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice firmer now. She wasn't just talking to the manager anymore. She was speaking to everyone in the restaurant. She wanted people to hear her, to understand. "I've been coming here for years. I've never caused trouble. If someone has a problem with me, I deserve to know what it is." The manager's expression flickered. Karoline could see a tiny hint of struggle in his face, like he was considering backing down. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see her point. But then, just as quickly, his face hardened again. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I've been instructed to ask you to leave." There was a brief pause before he added, "I don't have a choice." His voice had lost the firm edge it had earlier. Now, it almost sounded apologetic. Karoline took a deep breath. She could feel her heart beating faster, her pulse rising. But she forced herself to stay calm. She refused to let her emotions take control. She turned to look at the man standing beside her. He had been quiet all this time, just standing there, watching. But Karoline wasn't about to let him stay silent. She kept her voice steady. "I'm not leaving until I get an explanation." The man didn't speak. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he just shook his head slightly, like he wanted nothing to do with this situation. The manager looked at him too, almost like he was hoping for support. But the man didn't offer any. Karoline could see it now. Neither of them wanted to handle this. Neither of them wanted to be the one to tell her the truth. "Listen," Karoline said, trying to soften her voice just a little. "I'm not trying to start trouble. I just want to understand. If there's a real reason for me to leave, fine. But I deserve to know what it is." The manager looked at her. Then he looked at the man. For a second, Karoline thought he might actually say something. But instead he just sighed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said again. "It's just protocol." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Protocol?" she repeated. That word just hung in the air. "What protocol?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "I've been coming here for years. This place has always been welcoming. So what changed?" The manager and the man exchanged a glance. It was quick, but Karoline noticed. They were waiting. Waiting for her to break. Waiting for her to just give up and leave. But that wasn't going to happen. The silence in the room was thick, heavy. Karoline could feel the tension in the air. She could feel the eyes of other people in the restaurant. They were watching, listening, maybe even wondering the same thing she was. Why was this happening? "I'm still waiting," Karoline said, her voice even but firm. The manager shifted uncomfortably. He was struggling. Karoline could see it. For a moment, just a moment, his face softened again. Maybe he felt bad. Maybe he wanted to tell her the truth. But then, like before, he pushed those feelings away. "I don't have all the details," he admitted quietly. "I was just told to handle it." Karoline stared at him. "By who?" she asked. The manager hesitated. His eyes flicked to the man beside her. Then finally he spoke. "It came from the owner." The owner. Karoline's heart raced. Frank. Frank owned the Oak Room. Karoline had known her for years. Frank had always been kind, always welcoming. Karoline frowned. "Frank?" she asked, confused. "That doesn't make sense. I've known her forever. Why would she ask me to leave without telling me why?" The manager didn't answer. Instead, he glanced again at the man beside her. Karoline followed his gaze. And that's when the man, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice low. It almost sounded like an apology. Almost. But his words were still firm. Karoline tilted her head. "Not what I think," she repeated. Then what is it? The man hesitated. It was just a misunderstanding, he said. Karoline crossed her arms. A misunderstanding? She echoed. Then why didn't anyone explain it to me before it got to this point? She looked around the restaurant, then back at the man. I've been sitting here for over an hour. No one said anything to me. If it was a misunderstanding, someone could have just talked to me. The man shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't making eye contact now. Instead, he glanced at the manager, then back at Karoline. Something was off. Something was wrong. Karoline could feel it. She took a deep breath. Look, she said, her voice steady. I've always been a good customer. I've always been respectful. And I expect the same respect in return. If there's really a misunderstanding, then tell me. But don't just push me out without telling me why. The room was silent. The tension was suffocating. Karoline could feel it in her chest, in her hands, in the stillness around her. She watched the manager and the man beside her. She could see the struggle in their faces. She knew deep down that they weren't telling her something big, and she wasn't going to let it go. The man standing next to Karoline looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't know how. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if he was trying to find the right words but couldn't. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the manager, almost like he was waiting for him to speak first. The manager still hadn't looked at Karoline. He kept his eyes down, shifting slightly where he stood. Something about the way he avoided looking at her made Karoline's stomach twist. Something wasn't right. Then the manager finally let out a long, deep breath, as if he had been holding it this entire time. His shoulders sank and Karoline could see it. He wasn't just nervous. He was struggling. There was something weighing on him, something he didn't want to say. It wasn't just the pressure of the situation. It was guilt. Karoline narrowed her eyes. She could see it clearly now. The manager knew something was wrong. He knew that what was happening to her wasn't fair. And now he was starting to break under the tension. I'm really sorry about all of this, the manager finally said. His voice was shaky, uncertain. But the owner, she has some concerns about you. Karoline's heart skipped a beat. Concerns? She blinked, her mind racing. Concerns about her? That didn't make any sense. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had been coming to this place for years, always polite, always friendly. Why would the owner suddenly have a problem with her now? Concerns? Karoline asked, keeping her voice steady. What kind of concerns? She wasn't going to let them push her out without an explanation. If they had something to say about her, they needed to say it to her face. You're telling me I've been coming here for 4 years, she continued, and all of a sudden, the owner has a problem with me? What happened? I need to know. The manager hesitated. His eyes flickered toward the man beside Karoline again. The man looked uncomfortable, his hands twitching slightly at his sides, but he still said nothing. Karoline could tell that he was trying to figure out what to do. He didn't want to get involved. But Karoline wasn't going to let that happen. Not anymore. I'm just the manager muttered after a long pause. I don't know all the details. He shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck. But I think it's something to do with the way you've been, with the way you've been engaging with other customers lately. Karoline's eyebrows shot up. Engaging with other customers? She repeated. Her voice was laced with disbelief. What exactly do you mean by that? The manager looked even more uncomfortable now. His eyes darted to the man beside her again, almost like he was silently asking for help. Finally, the man stepped in. His voice was low, almost cautious. Look, he said. It's not really about you, okay? It's just, there was a misunderstanding. Karoline crossed her arms. A misunderstanding? The man swallowed hard before continuing. He was choosing his words carefully. The owner thought you were, making other guests uncomfortable. Karoline blinked. What? She felt like she had been slapped in the face. This was the first time she had heard anything like this. And it made no sense at all. She had always been polite. She had always been respectful. Sure, she was friendly and outgoing, she liked talking to people, but never in a way that would make anyone feel uncomfortable. Something wasn't right. This doesn't make any sense, Karoline said, her voice rising slightly. Uncomfortable? Oh, in what way? She looked between the manager and the man beside her. Neither of them answered right away. I've been coming here for years, she continued, her frustration building. I've never had a single complaint about my behavior. If someone had a problem with me, they should have said something. But no one ever has. The manager's face turned red. He glanced nervously at the man again. But this time the man didn't say anything. Karoline could feel it now, the cracks in their story. The way they hesitated, the way they avoided answering directly. It was like they weren't even sure about what they were saying. The manager finally dropped his gaze. "Look," he said quieter now. "I don't want to be in the middle of this. I'm just doing my job. But if you want to talk to Frank, maybe you should call her." Karoline felt a rush of triumph, but she didn't let it show. She wasn't going to accept a quick apology. No, this wasn't just about defending herself. This was about making sure this kind of treatment never happened again. "Fine," Karoline said, her voice sharp and firm. "I'll call Frank. But before I leave, I need the truth. No more vague excuses. No more dodging the question." The manager opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but then he closed it again. His words were trapped. Karoline could see it now. He was realizing how much he had messed up. The room fell into silence. Karoline stood tall. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about proving that she hadn't done anything wrong. This was about making sure that people like the manager and the owner couldn't treat others unfairly. But the real question was, what would Frank say when Karoline called her? Would she admit she had made a mistake? Or would this situation get even worse? Karoline took a deep breath. Her fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the table. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But she wasn't going to let it overwhelm her. She had fought for the truth. And now it was time to hold the people responsible. The manager already looked guilty. But guilt wasn't enough. Karoline didn't just want an apology. She wanted answers. She turned to the manager one last time. "Give me a moment," she said. Her voice was steady, controlled. She wasn't asking for permission. She was letting them know what she was about to do. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed Frank's number. Her fingers moved quickly, pressing each number with certainty. The phone rang once, twice. Then Frank picked up. Her voice was warm, familiar. "Karoline, it's been a while. How are you?" Karoline took a second to steady herself. Then she spoke. "I'm fine, Frank. But I need to talk to you about something important." She took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm at the Oak Room right now, and I was just asked to leave by your manager. He wouldn't give me a real explanation. And now, I'm being told that I somehow made other customers uncomfortable." She paused. "I don't understand, Frank. I need to know why this is happening." There was a brief silence on the other end of the call. Karoline could almost hear Frank thinking, trying to process what she had just said. Frank had always cared about her restaurant. She made sure it was a welcoming place, a place where people felt safe and comfortable. This didn't seem like something she would have let happen, unless something had gone wrong. Finally, Frank spoke again. "Karoline, I'm so sorry," she said. Her voice was softer now, almost apologetic. "I didn't know this was happening. I trust my staff, but if there's been a mistake, we need to fix it." She paused. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Karoline's grip tightened on her phone. She was about to find out the truth. Karoline sat at her table, trying to enjoy her lunch, but something didn't feel right. She had been coming to this restaurant for years. She always liked it here. The food was good, the place was clean, and the staff was friendly. But today something was different. She had barely started eating when the manager walked up to her table. He didn't look happy. His face was serious, and his hands were folded tightly in front of him. "Excuse me, Karoline," he said, clearing his throat. "I need to ask you to leave." Karoline frowned. "Leave? But why?" The manager shifted uncomfortably. He glanced around as if he didn't want other people to hear. "There was a complaint about your behavior," he said. Karoline's eyes widened. "A complaint? About her? That didn't make any sense." "I don't understand," she said. "I've been coming here for years. I've never had a problem with anyone. Who complained about me? And what did I do wrong?" The manager hesitated. He looked nervous. "I can't say," he muttered. Karoline's frustration grew. "You can't say?" she repeated. "You're asking me to leave because of a complaint, but you won't even tell me what I did wrong?" The manager didn't answer. Instead, he looked away, avoiding her eyes. Karoline took a deep breath. She didn't want to make a scene, but this was unfair. She wasn't just going to walk out without understanding why. She reached for her phone and called Frank, the owner of the restaurant. Frank had known Karoline for a long time. She had always been friendly and respectful. If anyone could clear this up, it was her. After a few rings, Frank answered. "Hello, Karoline. Is everything okay?" Karoline's frustration softened a little at the sound of Frank's warm voice, but she stayed focused. "Frank, I've been coming here for years," she said. "I've never had an issue with anyone. Not once. If someone had a problem with me, they should have told me. but no one did. Now I'm being told there was a complaint about my behavior, but no one will tell me what I did wrong. I was just trying to enjoy my lunch and suddenly I'm being asked to leave. There was a short silence on the phone. Then Frank let out a frustrated sigh. I am so sorry for this, Karoline, she said. I've known you for years. You've always been respectful and polite. If there's been a mistake, it should have been handled differently. I'll have a word with the manager immediately. This isn't how we run things. Karoline's heart slowed down a little. She could feel the weight of the conversation settling. Frank wasn't just apologizing, she was taking responsibility. She wasn't making excuses or ignoring the issue. I appreciate that, Frank, Karoline said, her voice softening. But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. I don't want to cause trouble, but I can't just let this slide. I understand, Karoline, Frank replied. I'll fix this right away. You deserve respect, and I'll make sure the staff knows that moving forward. I want you to feel comfortable when you come here. The conversation ended with Frank promising to handle the situation. Karoline put her phone down and looked at the manager. He stood there awkwardly, avoiding her gaze. The man who had been standing beside him had disappeared, probably to avoid the uncomfortable situation. The manager cleared his throat. I've spoken to Frank, he said. She's very upset about what happened and she's promised to make things right. Karoline nodded. She was happy with Frank's response, but she wasn't ready to let the manager off the hook just yet. I appreciate you talking to her, she said. But this whole thing could have been avoided if you had just communicated properly. I was a paying customer just trying to enjoy a meal. I shouldn't have been treated like this. The manager looked down, his face turning red. You're right, he admitted quietly. I should have handled it differently. I'm really sorry for the way this went down. Karoline's expression softened. Apology accepted, she said. But remember, it's not just about saying sorry. It's about treating people with respect from the start. No one should feel like this. The manager nodded earnestly. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Karoline gave him a small smile. I'm glad to hear it. Just make sure the next time something like this happens, communication is key. As she turned to leave, she felt the eyes of the other customers on her again. But this time it felt different. This time she had taken control of the situation. She had stood up for herself and shown that there was power in calm communication, even in difficult moments. When Karoline stepped outside, the cool air touched her face. She took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. The conflict was over, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't just about being asked to leave. It was about fairness. She had walked into the restaurant expecting nothing more than a nice meal. Instead, she had been put in a tough situation that tested her patience, her ability to stand up for herself, and her belief in fairness. But now that it was over, she felt proud. She hadn't backed down. She hadn't let her emotions take over. She had stayed calm and handled the situation with grace. And in the end, she had gotten the apology and answers she deserved. More importantly, she had made sure the problem was addressed so that no one else would have to go through the same thing. As she walked to her car, she thought about what she had learned. This wasn't just about a single moment in a restaurant. It was about self-respect. About speaking up when something isn't right. About how communication can solve problems. She could have left without saying anything, upset but silent. But instead she had asked questions. She had demanded answers. She had made sure she was treated with respect. And because of that, the manager and the owner now understood the importance of fairness. Karoline wasn't just proud of standing up for herself. She was proud that she had used her voice to make a difference, not just for her but for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. This wasn't just about a meal. This was about fairness, kindness, and respect in all areas of life. As she sat in her car, she smiled to herself. She had learned something important. Standing up for yourself doesn't always mean arguing or shouting. It doesn't mean causing a big scene. Sometimes, it just means staying calm, knowing your worth, and making sure others treat you the way you deserve to be treated. She wondered if the other customers had learned something too. Maybe they would be more likely to speak up if they saw something unfair. Karoline believed in leading by example. She hoped that what she had done today would remind people that speaking up can make a difference, even in small moments. As she drove away, she felt a sense of accomplishment. She had spoken up. She had been heard. And in the end, that was all anyone could really ask for. But most importantly, she had learned a lesson she would carry with her forever. In difficult situations, the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm, stand your ground, and always demand the respect you deserve. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more exciting stories filled with adventure, mystery, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world. It keeps these stories coming and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.